I think we should probably start with the one that stands out the most. I already said was coconut oil. Okay, so it's pretty much all saturated fat. And the question that we've answered a few times in the podcast actually is: too much saturated fat bad for us? Well, on paper, straight away, Jay, I'm sure you've seen the evidence for this. Is that too much saturated fat normally leads to increased LDL cholesterol
Yes.
levels, which, if you aren't aware, is normally referred to as bad cholesterol. Okay, we've got pretty consistent evidence now, I'd say from what I've seen anyway, that LDL causes cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. Yeah.
By too much
Yeah.
of it.
I guess like what we're going to allude to when we talk about coconut oil is the fact that even within the different designations of fat, as far as saturated fat, there's still different types of saturated fat, which is weird to think about. And there's different structures that sort of synergistically impact the impact of the fat. So, for instance, when you look at dairy or you look at cheese, a lot of times we find null results for, let's say, cardiovascular disease, and it's because of how that interacts with the saturated fat, the processing of that fat. But if you look at something like butter, I mean, the evidence is clear. More butter you have, kind of the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's about looking at these different nuances. Like for coconut oil, for instance, you mentioned that there's different structure of saturated fat for that, and you're completely right. So that will impact your risk.
Yeah, for sure. It was so with coconut oil, because you'll get people who are like big coconut and they're like massive supporters of it. Basically, there's it's lauric acid or lauric acid, however you want to pronounce it. And apparently this is supposed to be good for you. This is fine. But when I looked into it, basically there's a lack of human research which looks specifically at just coconut oil, and that's what makes it difficult for. Basically, the only evidence I've seen, like the consistent evidence, is basically saying that coconut oil will once again increase those LDL cholesterol levels, which is not ideal when we look at things like CVD. So my thought of that is coconut oil, yeah, have it in moderation. Again, I don't want to say it's bad for you. Like you can have it if people like the taste of it. 'Cause obviously, coconut's quite flavoursome, you could say. But I'd be wary of over consuming it because of what you see online that's saying it's good for you, because it's a different type of saturated fat. It's still, from what I can see on paper at the moment, it's still going to impact those LDL levels in a similar way.
I'd struggle to find any particular food that I would say is inherently bad for you, in the context of like, well, we're not really like measuring like a dose here, like in regards to, it's the poison that makes a dose at the end of the day. I mean, too much of anything could be bad for you. I'm not saying that coconut oil is great for you. We're not saying it's bad for you. It's just an option, Right.
But I wouldn't say it's I wouldn't call it a superfood, as some people might want to put it into that bracket.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There was actually a paper that
Sure,
guys. It was called the Dietary Lipids and Blood Cholesterol. So it was a meta-analysis of metabolic ward studies from, I think, the 1950s, 60s, and probably some of the 70s. And it's consistently shown that saturated fat in particular does impact blood LDL and cholesterol levels compared to the other forms of fat. So, I'm not trying to demonize saturated fat, because obviously that will make a part of some people's diets. But we have to pay attention to the clear connection here. We're raising a risk marker for disease when we consume too much of this thing.
As we'll go on to, there's other types of fat you probably want more of, but what I'm basically saying is, do not have the only oil you ever use being coconut oil, really, because then you are going to increase your saturated fat by quite a lot. Okay, but if you have a little bit, go for it. I know it's used quite a lot in curries, isn't it?
Especially if the bulk of your food is cooked in it.